Hi guys, welcome to the next video in my How to Write a History Paper tutorial series. I've done 3 already, so feel free to go check them out. I'll put some little links at the end of the video for you. We already talked about getting started, about writing the paragraphs, about writing your conclusion, and now we're going to do a brief tutorial on introductions. Now, the reason I put introductions so late in the series is because I hate writing them and I always write them last. I talk a little bit about this in my getting started video, but I find it's much easier to begin when you know where you ended, because then you know kind of how it will be circular, how you can bind the beginning and the end together so it flows very nicely. If you don't write in that way, fantastic. You don't have to. You can start at the beginning and work towards the end. The steps I have will work for you no matter what. I'm just approaching this from my own mentality and also how I tend to teach it. So I'm going to share the screen and we can begin looking at introductions. So when it comes to our video today, we're going to talk about the purpose of our introduction. Why are we bothering to write one? Why don't we just jump into our argument? We're going to talk about using what you already have, because odds are, whether you're starting at the beginning without having written your paper, or whether you're coming back to it having written the rest of your paper, you already have everything you need to write a really good intro. And of course, as always, we're going to go through things step by step, sentence by sentence, to give you a good idea of what the writing process might look like. Introductions for history papers operate a little bit differently than a standard introduction in a couple of ways. One of them is that we need to give 3 key points that you might not need in other genres. We need to know scope, so the time period that you'll be talking about. We need to know context, right? So we need place and we need problem. And we also need to know what your argument is going to be. You need to have all of this in the span of about 5 to 7 sentences. Very important that you make your position on the topic clear in this introduction. There should be very few surprises for your reader as they work through the rest of your paper. Obviously, though, you want people to want to read your paper. And part of how you do that is by giving them all the information they need to know, to think that what you're about to say is actually quite fascinating, or at least worth reading to learn something. As a fun fact, you do already have everything you need. If you've worked through this YouTube series in order, you already have a thesis statement and a conclusion. So you already have your main points and your argument and your mic drop moment. So you can just sort of reverse engineer what your introduction might look like. If you happen to be someone who likes to start with your introduction, then you have a prompt from your professor and you have all the materials your professor would like you to use. This is also plenty to get started with. That's all you need to start a good introduction. Your introduction starts with a lead. You might have been taught in high school or your intro composition courses in college to call this a hook, right? Something to grab your reader and bring them in. I called it a lead, and you'll see why in a minute. This is 1 sentence, maybe 2 maximum. Next, you need your context, which is all of the background information that will give your reader the information to understand your thesis statement, and then you have your thesis statement at the end. All of this together, again, is 5 to 7 sentences. Just like your conclusion, this is not supposed to be long. It's supposed to give us just enough of a taste to understand. Step 1 is your lead. Again, you've been told, usually most of my students have been told to call this a hook to get your reader interested. You might have been told to have a little anecdote, a fun fact, some sort of little pithy comment, maybe writing a story to get someone interested. In a history paper, this lead needs to tell people exactly the time and place your paper addresses. Bonus points if it's time, place, and problem. So time and place, and then the situation you're going to be analyzing. I find that this means my lead-ins are a lot more functional than fun. None of what I write in my introductions tends to be like the kind of thing you'd want to publish in a magazine. It's not that catchy, but it does get the job done. And I would argue that for a class paper that you don't need to publish, functional is more important than fascinating, and that's okay. Again, you have your own approaches, your teachers have their own approaches. This is my personal approach based on what I found to be effective, both as a student and as someone who grades student papers now. My example Although the United States saw itself as the savior of the world during World War II, the internment of Japanese Americans was anything but heroic. If you guys have already done my conclusion, then you see I've used that phrase already, which if I were going to edit this appropriately and turn it in, wouldn't be the case, but you can see the direct parallel here. Avoid certain things in your lead-ins. My biggest pet peeve, and the pet peeve of every single person I know who grades history papers, is variations on throughout time. It is probably the most annoying potential way to start your history paper. It's an overgeneralization, and it tells us nothing about the actual time and place you're writing about. Throughout time, people have struggled with racism, yes, and so that's probably not, it's not a good way to start. It's vague, it's frustrating, and you can't actually prove it. You're just clearly trying to find some way to start in. Other variations throughout history since the beginning of time and since blank was founded. I see that a lot in my papers that my students turn in. Since the United States was founded, unless you've been told specifically to start at the founding of this of whatever country or organization you're writing about and carry it to the present, you want to stay away from that because that's outside the scope of what the prompt is asking you to do. Dictionary definitions, please don't. It doesn't give us relevant historical information, and it's fairly elementary. Even when I was teaching English composition courses, I didn't like it there either because it's fairly rudimentary. Surely there is something else that interesting that you can say to start your paper. Another thing I see some students do, and I know how tempting it is, and it makes a lot of sense on some level, is a poetic description. Because people want to be interesting. They want people to, maybe they see beauty in what they're talking about, or they like the way the words play together. It does show that you can write elegantly. When I see a student have a poetic description at the beginning, it does show me that they know how words work, and that's always a good thing. But it does set a funky tone for a history paper sometimes because most historians don't really appreciate romanticization. We are taught as graduate students and throughout our undergrads not to make things sound better than they are. Historians are very cynical, pragmatic, to the point people in general. So if you're writing for a history professor and you start to wax eloquent about the beauty of the American countryside, that might set a bit of a weird tone. It might set them a little bit on edge unless they specifically asked you to do it. But from a practical standpoint, it does give while it does give good information sometimes, you kind of buried it inside some flowery language, so people have to actually think and interpret to figure out those little nuggets of information you might have left in there. And one of the goals of history papers in general and of introductions broadly is you want to give them information in a very accessible way. As you all know from reading your own articles and book assignments for class, attention spans are like this. They're itty bitty 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 bitty. And if you give people too much to sift through, they're not going to want to read it, so they're not going to get the information that you want. So flowery language in general is a bit of a no, especially to start out your introduction. Once you've sorted out your lead, you have to talk about the context. This is everything your audience needs to understand your upcoming argument. This might be basic historical information, who, what, where, when, that you might not have already covered in your lead. You might want to talk about the importance of the topic. It depends on the prompt. You're probably the best judge of that as you're writing. I tend to stick to the fairly utilitarian who, what, when, where. You might find that there's some significance that you want to impart in your introduction. Go nuts. My example, beginning in 1942 with Executive Order 9066, Americans of Japanese ancestry living on the west coast of the United States were rounded up and sent to inland concentration camps. This move was heralded as a precaution against Japanese spies after the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, but in fact systematically deprived thousands of citizens of their civil rights. You can see me talking about who, what, where, and when in here, right? Who, Americans of Japanese ancestry. When, 1942, what? Executive order leading to detainment. Where? Inland concentration camps, right? So we've got all of these bits in here, and now that gives us a good lead into our thesis statement. If you already have your thesis statement, go ahead and just plonk it down after your contact section and you're good to go. Edit as you need to in order to integrate it smoothly into your introduction. You want it to feel like part of the whole, not like something you wrote separately, even though you probably did write it separately. If you still need to draft your thesis statement, here's the Cliff Notes version of how. I'd encourage you to go check out my Get Started video also for a little bit more detailed lead-in. Take a look at the prompt you were given. How would you answer that prompt? Write down a couple of ideas, just a little brainstorm. See if you can condense those ideas into one sentence. You might have to leave out bits and pieces so that you have a cohesive sentence. That doesn't mean you can't use the bits and pieces in your paper, but it does mean they can't be in your thesis statement. And then, as I just said, stick that at the end of your context section, edit as you need to. Here's my quick thesis edit. There's my original. We've been working with this the whole time. My final version: despite claims of military necessity, the internment of Japanese Americans was an inhumane measure based on racist war hysteria rather than actual risk. So if we put it all together, I am going to read this one. Although the United States saw itself as the savior of the world during World War II, the internment of Japanese Americans is anything but heroic. Beginning in 1942 with Executive Order 9066, Americans of Japanese ancestry living on the west coast of the United States were rounded up and sent to inland concentration camps. This move was heralded as a precaution against Japanese spies after the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, but in fact systematically deprived thousands of citizens of their civil rights. Despite claims of military necessity, the internment of Japanese Americans was an inhumane measure based on racist war hysteria rather than on actual risk. See how all of that flows together. We've started fairly broad, right? Some of you might have been taught the inverted pyramid structure, right? Starting fairly broad and working gradually to the point. We still do that, right? World War II, Japanese internment. Here's specifically what happened with the internment. Here's what I'm going to tell you about it. So we go in that inverted pyramid structure and we end up really feeling like, boom, we can go into the rest of the paper. So a few takeaways to make sure that we're all on the same page. Your introduction will give your audience what they need to follow the rest of your paper. They may be more utilitarian than elegant. That's okay. The information your audience will get out of it and then carry through to the rest of your paper is more important than a few flourishes around the edges. I tend towards the utilitarian end of the writing spectrum regardless. I will always advocate for functional over elegant. And of course, everything in your introduction should lead smoothly to your thesis statement. It should all feel really smooth if someone doesn't have any jerks and bumps in the middle, okay? Thank you guys so much for watching. Feel free to check out the other videos. As I said, I'll leave some links here at the end for you. And let me know what you think. Hopefully this was helpful.